Here we go. And I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to just go back to my full screen sharing because that's how I like it. All right. So for this session, we're talking about assessment and feedback. There were two topics that came up in our check-in surveys as things people would like to kind of explore more and talk more about as they continue to navigate distance learning. One was interpersonal communication. The other one was assessment and feedback. So I didn't want to wait. I looked at my calendar. There aren't a lot of after school times available because they get swallowed up pretty quickly. That's why we're doing them both today so that people didn't have to wait till like mid-December to find the other one. So first of all, just your thoughts, and they are two different questions, right? What is the purpose of assessment? What is the purpose of feedback?
You're asking
I'm so mean.
Sorry.
I throw questions out to all of you.
No, I was listening to you the other slide. I'm like, are we supposed to answer that question? I'm so sorry. I'm still trying to get
No, it's okay. I do that a lot. I throw out a question and then I'm like, for you all.
I think assessment is important for the purpose of it would be for the teacher as well as for the students to see how successfully they are learning or grasping the material that they're seeing, and the feedback is absolutely critical so that students know how they did and what it is that they didn't do well and how could they do better. So it narrows things. It's like, first you did all these, now look, you have to focus on these to move forward.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to either follow up or build on that, or add any additional aspects that they were thinking of regarding the purpose of assessment and feedback? Excuse me.
For assessment is something that tools for us to depending on the result, so you can modify the way of teaching. So you can so you can use as a yes, the teacher has a tool, is actually a tool to change your way of teaching.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You hit on something, between the two of you, you've hit on something really important. Like, the purpose of assessment does somewhat depend on where you're at in that teaching and learning cycle. Is the purpose of the assessment to communicate student achievement of the objectives as the data shows us it is right at this particular moment? Or is it formative and it's an assessment for learning in order to give us the information we need in order to know, and for the students to know, as Karina was saying, their strengths with that particular objective and target, their areas of challenge, and their next steps. And so the purpose of assessment changes depending on if it's time to actually communicate out to students and families and others the degree to which students have shown they have met that objective, versus whether its purpose is to let us all, students and teachers, know where they're at right now, because we're just making progress towards the ultimate summative assessment, but we're not there yet. And so feedback, it looks different in those two scenarios as well, right? You can definitely still give feedback on a summative assessment that lets them know where their areas of growth are, especially if you are a teacher who allows reassessment. But you definitely want to let students know precisely what is successful about their little language artifact in those formative assessments, and what are some, not only their challenges, but I think it was Karina who said it, specifically what students can do going forward and should do and should focus on if it's a formative assessment, right? And we're going to talk about kind of both of those things a little bit today. So we'll go into more detail in a little bit. So this actually comes directly out of our new standards, right? There's a section in our new standards called Appendix 2. And one of the things it talks about is the shift in world language instruction, the way it used to be done back then, and the way world languages instruction is done now when it is aligned to our standards. So in red, you see a couple of things that were true of most world languages programs back then. For example, we tested students, but the tests were pretty much set up to find out what students don't know, right? They included things that were always well, let's see if they also know all the exceptions to the rule, right? And if they don't, we're going to mark them off because they didn't know the exceptions. And back then, the teacher knew the criteria for grading. There was a test, it had a scale. You marked off X number of points for this kind of error in this section, but on this other section, you marked off X number of points, and the students didn't necessarily know. And they also didn't know what those points meant, right? Even if it said points, it still didn't tell them anything in terms of proficiency as to what that meant in terms of how well they spoke or wrote or understood the language. Now, we actually assess for a completely different purpose. We want to know what students can do in the language, and our goal is to draw out of them everything they are capable of related to the learning target. We want to celebrate what they can do and find ways to give them opportunities to demonstrate that. And students understand the criteria for assessment, and students use rubrics as well, not just the teacher. The students receive the rubrics ahead of time. The class talks about the rubrics. The class starts to do sample grading, almost like the way AP readers do norming on the rubric, right? So they get samples of student work and they use the rubric to evaluate those samples so that they have a very clear understanding of what the different categories of proficiency on the rubric mean in terms of this task that we are doing right now. So my question is, if these two things talk about what assessment was back then and what it is now, what kinds of changes have to take place or are taking place already in our instruction in order for assessments to go from what they looked like back then in the red to what they look like now? I'll give you a minute to think about that, and you can use the microphone or you can put your ideas in the chat.
I think that now one of the critical things for us is to make sure that the students understand the purpose of the assessment. It's one of the things that we focus on, that they know the objective of this is that you show that you can do these, and that.
Mm-hmm.
And also the fact that the students, that we try to incorporate rubrics so that the students know exactly what they can expect given the work that they provide to us.
I think you're right, in the sense that if we say that the purpose of this assessment is to say that you can do this, this, and this, and by the way, here's what it looks or sounds like when a person can successfully do this, this, and this, right? And that's really helpful. Any other thoughts from anyone on what changes either have to take place or are taking place now as we look to design instruction in a way that's aligned to the standards and that helps the assessments move to this new way, which isn't necessarily as new for everybody?
Well, something that I've noticed from me teaching many years ago is that nowadays there's a lot of power that the student has to actually like choose what to do. Like we can offer choices for them to pick what homework per se they want to do, and I think that it's very powerful for them because they may want to work on something that they are not so confident about to maybe learn better. So, I mean, for me, for instance, whenever I was studying, I wanted that flexibility, that freedom. So I think they enjoy that and they want to pursue it better.
Right, absolutely. And I think another thing, in addition to that, I love that idea of the choices. And what you brought up is really powerful because we sometimes give them choices for how they might want to practice and deepen their skills as they're leading up to the assessment. We sometimes give them choices for how they will be assessed and how they will demonstrate their knowledge and understanding and their skills in the language. Another really important change, I think, that is called out when we look at these assessments and the way we assess world languages now is a shift in instruction that I think in our district, we've already been talking about for a couple of years now. So it doesn't feel so new as it does for some places, but that there is a very purposeful design of learning experiences so that the things the students learn, practice, get feedback on, practice again, and so on, have a very close correlation to the assessment. it's not this weird, like separate pathway. There's a much deeper understanding now of how important it is to do backwards design, know what your target is. If that's your target, it pretty much outlines for you what the assessment has to be, because especially in world languages, our can-do statements or our learning targets basically tell us what we're going to do for the assessment for that particular skill. And then backwards plan from there. If that's what the students are going to have to do, what skills are they already bringing to that assessment from previous learning? And now where's the gap between what they already know and what they need to know and be able to do in order to successfully demonstrate that they have met those learning targets? And we have a much clearer understanding of the importance of following that pathway than in the past, where a lot of what happened was, especially in places where people really, really used the textbook as like, it's Tuesday, we're on page 52 and tomorrow we'll be on page 53 and we're going to do all the things on the pages. What sometimes happened then was there was this weird, like, we did all the things on the pages and then we gave them the chapter test, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And it turned out there was this like divergence. We've all been there, I think, where you give them a chapter test and you're like, hold on a second, or you get ready to photocopy it even back in the day, right? And you're like, I don't remember them getting a lot of practice on that, because there wasn't this clear, pick your learning target, design the assessment that matches the learning target, assess what students already know and can do, and bridge the gap. It was just do this thing on this page. Now we're going to do this vocab list on this page. Now we're going to do these verbs. And then in the end, you're going to get this weird test that we'll talk about in a minute. So that's another change that's occurred, is helping plan. So back then we used to test to find out what students don't know. Now we're finding out what students know and can do. So teachers use measures to generate a profile of student strengths and weaknesses. They design tasks that require proficiency in language, culture, and even content as students become more proficient and they're able to work with authentic materials that talk about concepts in science, that talk about history, that talk about the arts. Those are content areas. And eventually, as the students get more proficient, we start building in tasks where they're going to have to use Spanish or French or Japanese. And they're going to do that while talking about content in Japanese, right? And demonstrating cultural knowledge in the way that they handle the tasks and approach the tasks and design, letters to people in the target language countries, and so on. And the other thing that's different now than what it used to be is teachers differentiate on multiple levels. Using a variety of methods, teachers differentiate the content itself, which is the content of instruction, but also the content of assessment, in order to allow students to reach their best level of challenge and success. They differentiate the process used to deliver the content, the process used to deliver the information, in order to help all learners succeed. We're seeing that a lot right now with distance learning as teachers start adding audio supports, sentence frame supports, using some of the tools we've purchased in order to give students in other content areas access to a dictionary or translate tool, and so on. And then we also differentiate the products that the students will produce, kind of like what Sheila was talking about with like those choice boards, right? We differentiate the ways in which students can successfully show us what they know and can do. Now students understand the criteria and use rubrics. So teachers use criteria that focus on language, culture, and content, but not language in the sense of you can conjugate verbs correctly 70% of the time, right? It's language in a communication sense. You can successfully set an appointment with a hairstylist or whatever it is that you're going to be doing. Students participate in self-assessment using the criteria and the rubrics like we talked about earlier, and students self-direct themselves when demonstrating knowledge and proficiency. That's pretty high level. They also self-direct when not demonstrating, right? They for themselves recognize that they have a goal area, something they need to work on, and they start seeking, this is our dream student, right? They start seeking additional support and ways to practice and ways to deepen their own knowledge so they can achieve those goals and those learning targets. One other thing, well, there's a lot to think about with assessment. So one additional thing to think about with assessment is to be really clear on what's meant by performance and proficiency. And while you'll hear me talk about proficiency a lot and the proficiency that students are showing on an assessment, the fact of the matter is, in the assessments we are giving our students, they are not proficiency tests. A proficiency test has no connection to a specific curriculum, textbook, method of teaching, set of units, set of vocabulary lists. It is completely independent of all of that. It is unpredictable, and it is actually administered by people who are specifically trained to conduct, for example, oral proficiency interviews where they know how to have a conversation. So this isn't the teacher usually, it's someone the student doesn't know. In a true proficiency assessment, it's someone the student doesn't know. Those two people sit down and they're going to have a spontaneous conversation together if it's a spoken assessment. It always starts with a nice kind of easing into it with some really basic things, greetings and checking in on how people are, asking some really basic questions. But then in order to figure out where the student's true proficiency is, the interviewer is skilled and trained in asking questions that are the hallmarks of the difference between two connected ranges of proficiency. And they keep asking until they hit breakdown and they can tell that the student can't effectively participate or respond. So they back off to the previous level of proficiency or range of proficiency. And they ask some more questions there. And if the student is successful, they try again to go up to that next one where the student had breakdown. And if then they're able to hold that conversation, they keep at that new high level and try to find the true area of breakdown where the student can't sustain conversation. It is something that people are specifically trained for. It is not what we do in our classes. What we do in our classes are actually performance assessments that are designed to give us a gauge of what a student's proficiency might be on that particular topic that we have specifically designed instruction and practice for. It is not their true proficiency range, because the true proficiency range gauges their ability to sustain conversation across all topics that are appropriate for that range of proficiency. Right. And it's totally spontaneous. There's no, it's like study. You can't really study for the SAT. You can't really study for a true proficiency test either, but you can review and prepare for a performance task because you know it's based on performing what you are able to do based on exactly what we have been working on in the learning experiences in class since the last performance assessment. So we know we learned how to talk about activities we do every day, and we learned how to talk about which ones we like and don't like, and we learned how to talk about which of those activities our friends and family also do. That might indicate that I'm functioning at novice high. But then if I try to talk about some other topic that's also at novice high, I'm not going to be able to do that. Why? Because class didn't prepare me for that. We haven't had that series of lessons and practice yet. So there is a difference between performance and proficiency. And when we say that a task is novice high, it doesn't mean the student is truly at novice high. It just means that we are designing instruction and then building in assessments to gather evidence of their ability to perform those tasks for that learning target, and we have prepared them to perform on that topic. Even if it's spontaneous, it says practice, but what we mean by practice is we specifically designed activities for them to practice having conversations about that, even if the conversations are spontaneous. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah? Okay. We are finding that for the most part, in order to be aligned with our new standards in California, we really aren't focusing as much on the chapter tests from the textbooks. Chapter tests are not backwards designed at all, as I referred to earlier. And as a result, what happens is they test mastery of lists and rules, and they look for mistakes rather than what students can do. That's how they're designed. They don't tend to test true communication. For example, many chapter tests will tell students, read the following paragraph and then conjugate all the verbs listed under the blank in the paragraph in the present or in the preterite or in the whatever. And of course, for Maki, I mean, if there's no conjugation, it'll be a different kind of grammar task in Japanese, but they tell you to follow a rule and show you can follow the rule. And in doing so, they create tasks often where the students don't actually have to show any comprehension of the language. If they know the pattern or the rule, they can successfully complete the task, lose no points on it, and still be completely unable to actually spontaneously write a good paragraph about themselves in the present, right? Because it wasn't a communicative task at all. It was a rule following task. They didn't have to understand or really be able to use any language to do it. That's a very common type of task. The other thing they tend to be is not authentic. Like they don't tend to use authentic materials for the reading or the listening. They tend to create reading texts and listening texts that limit all language use to things that have been previously taught by that publisher's materials, whether the students saw those lessons or not. And so they end up being a bit artificial. And of course, by their very design, they completely are devoid of any cultural context and true cultural perspectives because they weren't written from the point of view or for the point of view of native speakers at all. The items are discrete and uncontextualized, like those verb conjugation tasks, matching tasks, right? Nobody does that outside the classroom. Those aren't authentic performance tasks. The tasks tend to feel random, like you do a listening thing, then you do a vocab matching thing, and then all of a sudden on the next page, you're doing a paragraph fill in. And then after that, you're doing another reading, but it has like multiple choice questions. So they tend to feel very random. And it's usually graded on a 0 to 100% scale. Performance assessment seeks evidence of what students can do in a communicative way. It's realistic and it's contextualized, meaning that the students not only are told to do a task, but it's set in a situation that makes sense for doing that task so that students can make the connection between what they're being asked to do in the language and where that would happen in situations with native speakers. It's aligned to learning targets within the stage of proficiency. And it's not always graded, right? You can do formative performance assessments. When they are graded, they aren't necessarily graded in a 0 to 100% scale because it's really difficult to to break down an open-ended paragraph into a discrete set of points between 0 and 100. They tend to be graded with a rubric in a more holistic way, proficient, approaching proficiency, or learning target, exceeding the target. So in distance learning, I just happened to find, so if you don't know Meredith White, she's fabulous. She is a Spanish teacher in Georgia. You can follow her on Twitter at PRHS Spanish. She's also on Instagram, but I can't remember her Instagram handle right now. But she is also really funny. So if you just like funny things and language teachers with an amazing sense of humor, you will also like that. You'll like Meredith. I noticed last week or the week before, she actually posted a whole series of screenshots of how assessment works in distance learning in her classes. Now, I'm not saying everybody should do this. In fact, there's a couple things she does I distinctly don't agree with, but that's just my opinion too, right? Like you have to do what works for you and for your learners. So this is neither a thing that says you should do all the things Meredith is doing, nor is it saying that just because if I disagree with something, you have to disagree with it also. It doesn't mean that. But what she does is over the period of 3 weeks, so they have a very regimented, and this is something done in her whole department. So they've come to agreement on this. They have a fairly rigid schedule of 3 different kinds of assessments. In the course of 3 weeks, they do 3 small assessments, little mini ones, 1 mode at a time: interpersonal, interpretive, presentational. Those only happen on Monday through Thursday, not every day. There's 3, right? Weeks 1 to 3 of the 3-week period. There are, over the course of that 3-week period, there are a total of 3 small assessments. One's going to be interpretive, one's going to be interpersonal, one's going to be presentational. Excuse me. Feedback is given, retakes are encouraged. Okay. The highest score from the week is recorded. So let me rephrase that because I'm pretty sure it's actually 3 small in each mode. So over the course of 3 weeks, there's 3 small interpretives, 3 small interpersonals, and 3 small presentationals. And then the highest score from weeks 1 to 3 is what gets recorded in the grade book. Over the course of those 3 weeks, they also do 2 medium assessments that combine 1 to 2 modes. It might be a more in-depth assessment in just 1 mode, or it might be one that does an interpretive task followed by a presentational task related to the authentic document in the interpretive task. It is self-graded for the interpretive. In other words, it also might just be auto-graded, right? Depending if they're able to use a Google form and have it auto-grade. And then open-ended performance tasks that the teacher will have to look at. And there's 2 of those in the 3-week period. And then there's 1 large assessment, essentially an IPA, an integrated performance assessment. It encompasses 2 to 3 modes. These are where the tasks are all performance tasks, and the first task logically leads into the second task, which logically leads into the third task because there's such a rich context. For example, this is the same example I always give because it's easy for me to remember. For example, you receive a letter from your pen pal, right? You receive a letter from your pen pal heading up to the fact that you're going to get to visit them. You're going to stay with their family. So read the letter. They answer some questions about it. That's the interpretive task, right? Then they have shown their comprehension of both the cultural elements and the linguistic and content elements of the letter. Now, based on that letter, they're going to have an interpersonal, a spontaneous conversation where they talk with a classmate and record that conversation probably about the content of the letter and what questions they have for their pen pals and what things they would like to do when they meet the family and in the town where the family lives. And they have that spontaneous conversation. And that leads to their ability to write their response back. Now they have the first letter. They talked about the letter they received from their pen pals in the interpersonal one. And now that they've talked about it, they have an even better idea of what they want to do, what they want to ask, what they want to say. So now they're going to do their presentational writing task and write the response back. And that would be the large assessment. And they use a 10-point scale. Does not meet expectations for 2, 4 points is approaches expectations, 6 is meets, 8 is exceeds level 2, and 10 points is exceeds at like the top, right? And even notice, even at that, you still make mistakes, even if you get a perfect score. But they are totally appropriate mistakes because you're in Spanish 1, right? So this is just one sample rubric, and they even put at the bottom, you can redo this. What happened? It's okay. Let's try again, right? And so they have that there, and they only accept redos, it looks like, for 4 or 2 points. These are some differences that you may have with your own practices. I only used a 4-point scale, for example. I didn't use a 10-point. I allowed redos at any point. If people want to show greater proficiency, I'm all for it. But that's, again, your choice. I also didn't have as many things being graded as they did, but I liked how they broke down like the choice, like Sheila was talking about, like you have a choice of these first ones, the small modes, you get to choose which ones actually go in and impact your grade. So, you know, then she even gave an example from what the students see in their online platform, which is not Google Classroom. Notice how everything's kind of 100 points, and I do disagree with that, but that's just my thing. But ignoring that, you can see how it set itself up in her gradebook. Unit 4, classwork 1, and then quiz 1. And so these would be kind of the, excuse me, the choice assignment from the student, and then the level 2 assessment would be this one. And then they have for the next week, they get to pick their choice of which one of those small assessments they were going to include. And then the teacher's level 2 assessment, and then their week 3 choice of what they wish to include in the gradebook. And then that large assessment with the 2 to 3 modes included. Now, this is all from Meredith. Again, just to give you a sample of what that might look like in distance learning. And then she even gave kind of a template of for them in their department, what this looks like for what students do synchronously and asynchronously, right? As they go through the weeks. So being really intentional and clear about how it is that students what they'll be doing in their synchronous instruction versus what they'll be doing asynchronously, getting feedback on that because Go Formative gives them feedback automatically, and so on. And then over here, it shows that they're going to have that medium 1 of 1 on top of getting to choose which of their small tasks they're going to include in the gradebook. Medium 2 plus the small task of their choice for the gradebook. And then the large 1 plus the small task from the gradebook. See how it says small 1 of 3, small 2 of 3, small 3 of 3. Although I am not Meredith, do you have any questions about that you wanted to ask as you saw some of the things that I was sharing with you that Meredith prepared?
I do have a question.
Sure.
It's not so much about this. I do like the doing different modes in the different weeks. It's more about the textbook and the assessments and what an assessment
Yeah.
is and what an assessment should not be. And here's my question. It is clear that we're moving away from the strict grammar, right? We're moving away from the chapter tests and things like this. So my question is, are we going to move away from having a textbook, or are we going to continue having a textbook even though
Here's
we
why.
are not encouraged to have a textbook?
Yes. So here's why. Actually, by state law, we cannot move away from having some kind of adopted instructional material. It doesn't have to be a textbook. Theoretically, for example, if we could get it approved by our curriculum and standards committee in the district and then by our board, we could, in theory, write our own curriculum for the district. I don't think any of us has time for that, but if we wanted to, we could, right? Mm-hmm. But by law, we must provide students with an adopted instructional material resource that they can consult as part of the thing. So what I did to kind of balance that, first of all, I did not throw out the whole textbook, even though you can tell it definitely wasn't like the end all and be all of my instruction. Certain tasks are actually well enough designed for me to use for practice, particularly for the early, when I'm teaching, we're learning a new concept, whether it's a new grammatical structure concept, or it's a new thematic vocabulary set. Those often are found somewhere in our materials, right? And so I can leverage the better designed activities in the book and resources for practice activities, and even for assessment activities. If there are some that are well written, I used them. If they actually did a good job providing a context and a reason for what the students were doing, I could use those. But I didn't see it as the only thing. So I supplemented that with additional authentic resources, a lot of additional tasks that I created, and so on. But we will continue to have a textbook. Here's what's interesting. This coming year, there's a group of people. I don't know if any of you applied. I sent the information out a couple of ways back when it was time to apply still. The state of California will be doing its instructional materials adoption for world languages. And they only technically adopt for grades K through 8. But the reality is any books designed for grades 7 and 8 are the same ones designed for essentially grades 9 and 10. If someone was to start in year 1 in grade 9, right? So whatever publishers create for 7th grade Spanish is, or even if it's like 2 books, like there's a Spanish 1A and a Spanish 1B, that's basically the year 1 book for high school. And it's the same materials. Same for year 2. So we will be participating in an instructional materials adoption. I will be part of that work. Actually, I won't be one of the reviewers. I'll actually be facilitating one of the review panels. I don't know which one yet. I don't know which publisher's materials I'll have yet. But the interesting thing, and the thing I'm waiting for, and Pearson, now Savas, clearly picked up on this because they started attending, like they came to some of our local PD in Sacramento on the new standards, because they looked at the standards and said, oh God, we can't use the books the way they've been written before. We are going to have to do a wholesale rewrite, or the state of California will not find them to be in compliance with standards. And all of us went, yes, they finally get it. They don't just get to put a new cover on the book and then give us the same book, right? Like they actually have to look at our standards and go, oh my God, it really is all about communication. So I'm tentatively very excited to see what publishers present to us. We won't know until July. So what will happen is in April, there will be a week-long training for everybody who's been selected to be part of the review panels. And then in July, there'll be a week of they actually receive their materials in May. They spend May to the end of June reviewing those materials, taking copious notes, lots of them. And then in July, we meet to find out what they found in their review and determine whether or not we will recommend this book for the state of California. Districts are no longer required to purchase books from the state adoption list. It is just a resource now for districts. Districts are allowed to choose books that are not on the list. Or materials. We have to say instructional materials now because some of them are totally online, like students in science and in ELA have completely online materials, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
So no, we are not getting rid of instructional materials. We are required by law to have them and to provide them to students. So I was always really intentional about telling students, look, either if you were absent or you need a review or you just don't like the way I explained it, the same concept or the same set of vocabulary, you can find it here in your book if you need that. And I also, as I said, used any of their materials from the supplemental resources, the textbook itself, the assessment pages. If they were well designed and were going to help my kids get to the target, I used it. Right? Did that answer your question?
Yes. Another thing about that, will it be possible for, like, if I have a group of teachers who have been creating their own tests and trying to create their own IPAs and stuff, is there a way for us to create a learning team for that? Is there any chance for the district to?
Unfortunately, right now, the rules for learning teams, and this comes back for like negotiations between the district and the union from quite a bit ago now. And there was definitely a concern that, and I'm not for being right or wrong, I have my opinion on this, but it's neither here nor there because it's basically our policy. There was a concern that teachers could not earn extra hours for essentially doing the work that is expected of them as teachers and that they would do in their prep time, like planning lessons or creating assessments. I know. So for now, no. Could that be renegotiated one day? Perhaps. The one exception to that, and that's why it was such a big exception, was you might have noticed earlier, I don't know that it's still available now, but earlier in the semester when we saw that, doing these lesson plan, like the ones you participated in where you actually were able to contribute lessons to the lesson bank, we actually made it possible for people to form a learning team and craft additional lessons to be reviewed and considered for entry into the bank, which is very unusual because they could make a learning team, get hours for it. And that is not something that they had to make an actual exception to what our rules say for learning teams, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I managed to get around this sometimes before, right? Where if I can design tasks, let's say we design a learning series around assessment. And as part of that learning series, part of the work you do involves crafting performance tasks that are aligned to some of the best practices that we're learning about. Right? It would be mostly synchronous, but then you provide you'd have time built in to design tasks. We'd review them, maybe rubric them, take a look at how they'd fare, edit and revise them based on that. And ultimately, guess what? You'd be able to use them, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Well, I think, where I'm going is, it would be, I just feel that we do not, and maybe it's just because I'm a little bit isolated, I don't know, but it just feels like we don't have enough opportunity to actually work on things together among the other world language teachers. Right now, this is my first time seeing Sheila. I think I haven't met you before, Sheila. Nice to meet you, by the way. But she's teaching Spanish 1. Oh my gosh, I would love to be able to collaborate and say, hey, look, these are projects that I do in class. Like, what do you do? Or what about we come together and we spend, an hour or two creating an IPA for, for these. And just things that we can actually use in the classroom,
Yes.
Things
and
that we can collaborating and have.
Yes, nothing is stopping you from doing that. We just by contract cannot give hours for it.
Okay.
Sorry. So and you might find, especially depending on what model ultimately gets selected for when we can return. No, I don't have any information on what's changed now that we went back to purple. Sorry.
Yeah.
But we know, I have a feel, my gut reaction is the district is still going to be aiming hard and making all of us in the DO work really hard on preparing for return January 5th in case there's a miracle.
Yes.
Right? Because if there's a miracle, we're going back. Eventually we are going back anyway. But let's say, whatever model they choose, I think you saw there's a lot of it's built in that Wednesday is this kind of prep time in almost every model, if not every model, if I recall correctly. A big chunk of Wednesdays is prep time, which means you wouldn't have to use your own time. You could make maybe a once a month or an every 2-week appointment with Sheila on Wednesdays and be like, hey, do we want to work on the next assessment for such and such unit? You could do that. And it would be during your school day.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. When that will happen, I have no idea because now I don't know what's happening. So I do think there'll be some kind of communication. Well, there's a communication scheduled for tomorrow, but originally the communication that's scheduled for tomorrow is to share what model we will be using at elementary and what model we'll be using at secondary. I'm sure that's still the communication. I just don't know if it will now include any additional information. Like the model we select, whatever it was, and no, I have not heard what it was, so I'm not hiding it from you. I have plausible deniability. I don't know what it is. But whatever model was chosen will still be the model, even if we don't get to go back until February or March.
Got it.
You know what I mean? Like, unless something unforeseen happens, whatever model was picked is the model. So I think they will probably still communicate that out. My gut instinct says they're going to communicate out that they are hoping beyond hope that things reverse and we can come back January 5th with a plea to families to please do what's right. Please don't gather at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Please wear your masks, or we don't get to come back. Like, you can't just be mad at the district like you are if you're not going to do the things, right?
Yeah.
And then maybe they might have some information for what's the plan if it turns out we stay in purple. But that's just my gut instinct, since they're already putting a communication out tomorrow anyway. I thought maybe I would hear something from my boss today. Zippo. That tells me they are locked in rooms writing things, because we've heard Zippo, like nothing. So we want assessment tasks that motivate students to do the task. We want them to be drawn to the task. You've all seen it. Like, if students are interested in a task, all of a sudden they'll try so much harder to participate in it, to do well at it. They want to do it. They want to share what they've done and what they know and what they can do and what they can say. So that's another factor to consider when you're designing your performance tasks for any of the modes, right? I remember I actually had, for reflexive verbs in French, which is not a thing, Makiko, for Japanese at all. So be happy, because the reflexive verbs are one of the banes of language student experience in the Romance languages. I actually found an authentic text where it was the personal assistant to Napoleon and his wife Josephine, and he wrote this diary. And in one entry of the diary, he talked all about their daily routine. I was like, are you kidding? It was like what time they get up, what they do when they get up, when they have breakfast. And it was like daily routine. It was perfect. Well, when I gave it, I designed an interpretive task around that, using some of the best tools out there to really make standards aligned interpretive tasks. And I actually had comments from students about how much they loved it because they learned something while they were taking the assessment. Right. And that's the kind of thing, like, even if it's a reading task, we can make it engaging by the topic or what we pick. So just something to think about. What I've provided for you on this slide is just some ideas, and they are not rules. They are not things you have to do. But just some ideas for if you are going to design tasks, how, like, logistically, what technology tools will facilitate you doing those tasks, whether they are for practice and formative assessment or whether they're for summative assessment, right? In interpretive tasks, it's not just comprehension. It's the ability to read or understand while they listen between the lines. It's their ability to understand the culture well enough to know what nuances are being also provided by this particular document, right? All of that goes into interpretive. It's not just word for word comprehension. It's much more than that. That's why it's called interpretive and not comprehension. One tool you can use is this IPA task template. I have shared it before. It's from Actful. And what it actually does is it gives you tasks that go beyond just the multiple choice questions we often see. And you have to rewrite it. That's why it's just a PDF. You can look at it and then create your own thing in a Google Doc or a Google form. Either way works. You select some keywords, and they actually, in English, that are located in the text somewhere. And your students need to find that same word or phrase in Japanese, in French, in Spanish, in that authentic document. The really interesting thing about this task is students are like, that's it? Well, yeah, again, these tests are not a trap. We're not trying to find out what you can't do. Yeah, this was the key vocabulary we practiced all unit, and darn it, you should recognize it if you see it in a text. In theory, you should be able to predict what you think the words will be when you see the English list and be right when you look in the text and try to find them. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a trap. Another potential task, having them provide the main idea. Why in English? Because you don't want their novice, for example, level proficiency to interfere with their ability to tell you whether or not they got the main idea. It's not a writing task. We're not grading their writing in French or Spanish or Japanese. We're trying to make sure they understood the main idea. So we let them do that in English, especially at the lower levels of proficiency. Another task you could consider is having them find supporting details to support the main idea. I like this one a lot, actually. What you do is you give them a list of possible supporting details, but not all of them are even in the text. They seem plausible, they seem possible based on the text, but they aren't all in fact in the text. And then they actually have to, if they think detail A is in the text, they go to the text itself, they circle A here, and then they go to the text itself and they write the letter A where they think that detail was located. It gives you a lot of insight as to what they understand. So there's several things here. Do not ever, ever, ever do them all. That will take them 3 days of traditional periods to finish just the interpretive task. And not all of these tasks are appropriate for every range of proficiency. So you need to select the tasks that make sense for what the learning target is, that makes sense for the range of proficiency of your learners, and what it is you need to know about what they know and can do. Some technologies for listening or viewing in ASL would include Edpuzzle or Fluent Key, Edgy for reading, Go Formative also for reading, and for listening, because you can include video in Go Formative or audio. Obviously, Google Forms is another great source. Just know that if you give a video in Google Form, they can't make it bigger. It only shows up in the square that it's in the form. So I like to, sometimes I might provide a link in the same question if they'd like to see it full screen. Also be careful, there might be subtitles available in other languages. So you have to watch for that on your videos. For interpersonal, some helpful technologies, breakout rooms with appointments. So you actually schedule appointments with students to come in and either have a conversation with other that you watch and grade or a conversation specifically with you. Linked language, fee-based tool. You can do a little bit for free, but the rest of it is fee-based. Extempore, even more expensive, fee-based. Also, students can practice. If they're willing to share phone numbers, they can practice over the phone or via texting. They can also go online. Nothing stops them from creating a Zoom on their own, just so you know. So they can go into their own private Zooms. We can't stop them. There's really good benefit to that. We just also know there's some pretty bad behavior happening in them, and there's nothing we can do, unfortunately. For presentational tasks where they want to create content for an audience of listeners, viewers, or readers of the target language, they can use Google Docs and Slides, Adobe Spark, Flipgrid, Screencastify Submit, which is where you create an assignment, send them a link. They don't even need Screencastify. They click the link, they record their response, they send it to you. All done. They don't need any software. They don't need a code. They just need the link. And then I talked about this in the last session and you were all there, but if there's cheating happening, first of all, try to eliminate cheating by how you design learning experiences. If practice is clearly aligned to assessment, students have far less need to cheat. If students had opportunities for feedback and growth, they already know and they can trust that they don't need to cheat to do well on this assessment. So if we use these really high leverage strategies about our lesson design and learning experience design that's backwards designed, and they're getting feedback all along the way, and they're getting evidence after evidence after evidence that they're doing okay with these tasks, and then they get the assessment, and guess what? It's the tasks they've already seen that they can do. There's no need for them to cheat. Do the task and the rubric actually correspond to the proficiency range of learners? Sometimes teachers actually kind of overshoot the mark and accidentally create tasks that are beyond what the learners could reasonably be expected to do. When that happens, learners feel the only option they have is to cheat because there's no way for them to do successfully. Are the prompts personalized? It's much harder to cheat if it's so personalized that there's no way they're going to find all the information they need online because nobody online is them. And then for writing, as I said in the last session, consider the draft back add-on. I have to check the time. Oh gosh. Okay. Formative assessment. One of the things I wanted to talk about is climbing this kind of climbing the steps to get from the beginning of the learning cycle all the way to that final performance assessment on any given learning target. So just a reminder, you want to start by getting the learners ready to learn. Do something when you start a new unit or a new lesson within a unit that connects to prior learning so that they already get a refresher of what things they're going to need in order to be successful with these new tasks. And they get a chance to remind themselves that they still know those things and they can still do those things, and set the stage for the new learning. Do the first chunk of your new lesson. Remember, break your lessons into digestible chunks. Conduct formative assessment on that first chunk with multiple checks for understanding. There's kind of a range of checks for understanding that generally speaking, what is thought of as a good process to go through. Let's say you're doing a new linguistic structure or a new set from a larger unit vocabulary theme. The first checks for understanding should not require them to say or write the words at all. It should be for them to demonstrate understanding of that concept or those words. So they should be able to physically in some way indicate their understanding, whether they're doing something online where they select a response, they're just indicating yes or no to demonstrate that they understand. Then you try either or. Should it be this or this? You're providing all the language they need. They just have to parrot back the one that is the correct answer. Then you go to an open-ended, show a picture, what is this? And they actually have to produce the word themselves for the first time, or they have to use the new structure for the first time in an open-ended way. When teachers do that, student achievement really does increase if they are purposeful and thoughtful about embedding that every time. So you do that with the first chunk of instruction. Because you've seen that they're ready and they have seen that they're ready, you can now do part 2 of your lesson, followed by more formative assessment checks for understanding that start with the stuff in part 2. But then as you get towards the end, you start revisiting the things from part 1 of the lesson so they don't forget them, right? And you use that cycle. Physical response, draw a picture, drag something from one column to another to show they understand, then yes, no, then either or, then open-ended. Now they're ready for guided practice. It tends to look a lot like the last checks for understanding. Then they do independent practice that looks a lot more like the assessment tasks. And then they do performance assessment. Note on the independent practice and also guided practice, they need feedback. So formative assessment comes up multiple times in this. We are constantly doing it. We do it informally and formally, just through observation sometimes. Sometimes we use formal tools to gather information about our students. The students and the teacher are engaged in formative assessment tasks. They can occur spoken, written, responding to authentic texts, either video, audio, written. They can be gamified if you're working on very discrete grammatical structures or very discrete vocabulary topics. You just want to move away from that as fast as possible. Once you've got evidence and the students have evidence that they know the structure, move on to something communicative. Even though you think all they want to do is play the game, they really need to use language in context in communication. And then, as either Karina or Sheila said at the beginning, the data from that informs follow-up instruction. It informs students on what their next steps are personally. It informs them on what they are doing well and can continue to do the same way they've been doing it because it's good, and so on. So this is just some information, more information about what these things are and what happens next. In addition is responding to the data. So making changes, providing actionable feedback, and feedback is the goal, not the grade. Feedback is what they need in the formative assessment stage. You can document that they did it. I like to document those kinds of things in such a way where they don't impact the grade, but the students and the families can still tell whether or not the student participated and whether or not they were successful. I like to do that a lot. So if you think about a time that you conducted a formative assessment in your class, you can probably think of many. They could have been with a technology tool or not. what you want to ask yourself about any formative assessment you're doing, will the data tell me what I need to know at this point in the student's cycle? When the students do this activity, what are they communicating to me about their abilities towards the learning target? Right? What are they showing me and themselves? Do the data give me an indication if they're struggling or if they're ready to move ahead? Because that changes my response, especially if some are struggling and the others are ready to move ahead. Now we have to differentiate and provide each group what they need, hoping to ultimately get the struggling group up to the point where they're also moving ahead to the same learning target. One interesting thing there is, oh, I lost my train of thought. Hopefully it comes back to me because there was something I really wanted to tell you right there. Are there aspects of their learning that need to be scaffolded or supported? Kind of goes back to if they're struggling, right? We really want to get students to the point where they're, even if they're struggling, you want to design formative assessment tasks that don't just tell you yes or no, they know the answers, but that give you some insight. If they don't know, the answers give you some insight as to where the breakdown happened. That makes differentiation a whole lot easier. The main place where you can do this is in multiple choice tasks. You really want each of the wrong answers to provide you with a different kind of information of what the problem is that the student has. So instead of just having one right answer and then one or two wrong answers that are just, super random, and of course they're wrong, you want distractors or wrong answers that tell you, they don't understand the correct word order for this kind of sentence. And in another one, maybe one of the other wrong answers shows you that they actually don't understand the meaning of something critical. It's not a word order issue, it's a meaning issue. And because they don't have the meaning right, they can't answer this correctly. So you want to do wrong answers that tell you something about what students need. And then obviously, when you look at the data from this formative assessment, are there any common errors that multiple people are making? Because that tells us something about the instruction that the whole group needs. And then you want to ask yourself from the data, what are the learners themselves learning from this process and from their own responses? Okay, so those are all things you want to do. I have some resources for you that I think you would like, because I know we are almost done here. I have some resources here that I think you will like, that I encourage you to check. One is an article that has a couple of new ideas about a couple of formative assessments you might like. You might have to adapt them for distance learning, but take a look when you click on that article, particularly at circle, triangle, square, and also what they call tag feedback. I think you'll really like it. And then I gave you another article on providing feedback that students actually use. So I'm going to give you the link to the chart, to this presentation. I realize we're done and I want to honor your time, but in summary, feedback that works is timely. It's information students can actually use, and it's meaningful to them because it'll have a better impact on their performance task. I also gave you information on how to provide feedback that isn't just you doing it all. So take a look at this slide on ways that all these things you do first, and only for tasks that can't receive feedback either automatically or with peer feedback and self-reflection, those are the only ones you give individualized feedback on, right? That helps cut down the feedback work for you. And it's still meaningful and acceptable to our students and helpful. So let me put this in the chat for you. And I'm going to stop the recording as well. And I'm going to stop share. And I want to thank you for doing all this work with me today and spending 2 whole hours with me.
Thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome. So let me do that. Here's your second document. Don't forget to save it to your Google Drive. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye,
Nicole.
everybody. Email me by all means. Bye, Sheila. Bye, Makiko.
Bye, querida.
Karina.
Nice to meet
Good
you.
to see
Nos
you,
vemos.
Makiko.